Um, so sometimes these unsaturated fatty acids are called good fats, and that just simply means that they are considered heart healthy. Including these fats in your diet can actually help to lower our cholesterol, lower our risk for heart disease and stroke. Um, and so, again, we want to include these regularly and consistently in our diet. Um, Proportionally more than saturated fats, but there's no need to consume them in excess. We know that there's benefits, to sauteing vegetables and olive oil, making dressings out of it, eating nuts and seeds and fatty fish. But really, there's no need to be like drinking a little shot of olive oil a day, because again, remember this category of fats is the most energy dense. All right, so lastly, we're going to talk about cholesterol. So there is a difference between dietary cholesterol, that is the cholesterol that we typically get from food items. Eggs is a really common example, hence why I chose that picture for this slide, and blood cholesterol. Now, we typically just think of, oh, cholesterol is so bad, and we always want to aim for low cholesterol. But cholesterol actually does play a lot of really important roles in our body. It aids in hormone production, cell structure, and our bodies are actually able to regulate it to a bit. So our bodies can synthesize blood cholesterol. We do get some. So if you go to the doctor and you get your annual labs drawn and you're given your blood cholesterol levels, and those are broken down. We'll talk about that next. Um, but that's considered our blood cholesterol. Like I said, our body can synthesize it, can regulate it a bit. Dietary cholesterol does impact this number a bit, but not as much as we had once thought historically. We now know that what impacts our blood cholesterol levels more so than one-to-one dietary cholesterol is really those overall lifestyle factors. So overall diet, the types of processed foods, if you're having lots of those foods that are high in saturated fats, lifestyle, and activity levels impact this number more. There's also a pretty strong genetic component to our cholesterol levels as well. So some of it can be, you can definitely do things to support healthy cholesterol levels, but sometimes if you have a strong familial history of high cholesterol, that definitely plays a role as well. So if you do get your annual labs drawn, you'll generally be told you have a total cholesterol level, which is just an indicator of our overall levels. LDL cholesterol, which is sometimes referred to as our bad cholesterol, and that's the number that we usually want to aim to lower. And then HDL cholesterol, which is considered our good cholesterol, and that's the level that we typically want to see a bit higher. So lastly, I just wanted to touch really briefly on trans fats. We do still see them on food labels, even though they have been taken out of the food system. Um, Trans fats do occur naturally in some foods, for example, meats in very small trace amounts. Um, the word trans has to do with the organic chemistry form of the molecule of that fat molecule. Um, in the food systems in the past, we really synthesized these fats and included them in a lot of food products to make them more shelf stable, especially those foods that do have fats in them. If we think like um, cookies from the bakery or like refrigerated pie crust or cinnamon rolls, those types of things were often high sources of trans fats. After they were introduced to the food system, we saw a significant increase in cardiovascular disease, and through research really found that that was a direct association to the increase in trans fats. So they were kind of weaned out of our food system, and I'm a little rusty on this fact, but I think they were required to be entirely removed from the food system by the year of 2020. So you'll still see the trans fats listed on nutrition facts labels, but it's not really of concern anymore. I just wanted to touch on it because some people do still have questions about trans fats, and many of you, if you learned nutrition in school, probably learned to avoid foods with trans fats in them. All right, so next, that concludes fats. We're going to dive into proteins. So, proteins play many functions in the body, including tissue growth and maintenance, structure, so our muscular structure, that lean body mass. It also aids in certain metabolic processes, hormone synthesis and use, etc. Again, this is a very short list of all the functions of proteins in our bodies. Um, Proteins, again, are important to include with most meals and snacks, and they contribute to feelings of fullness from a meal or snack, but also they contribute to what we consider our satiety factor or simply feeling satisfied from a meal. Um, Proteins are also important to kind of focus on if we are really wanting to manage our blood sugars and keeping more consistent blood sugars, because we know that including a protein with a meal or a snack, especially if that meal or snack includes, a carbohydrate source, it's going to prevent such a high, blood sugar increase and drop after and keep our blood sugar levels more consistent. So, especially if you are someone who's aiming to manage diabetes through diet, ensuring that you're getting a protein source with most of your meals and snacks. Now, most people think we just need to eat loads and loads of protein, and there's lots of really trendy, protein powders and protein bars and, like desserts with protein in them. We don't necessarily, for the average person, we don't necessarily need to load up on a lot of excess protein. And what I really recommend instead is just focusing on a variety of different protein sources in your diet. We really don't need to fortify unless, maybe there's a medical reason where you need a bit more assistance in healing, or if you really are having a hard time getting enough protein in, then that might be a time to supplement. But for the average person, there's generally no need. So I'm going to talk about the differences between plant-based proteins and animal-based proteins. So if we think of protein, itself as far as macronutrients go, it's typically not going to be the macronutrient that impacts our blood sugar. However, some plant-based proteins, and plant-based proteins are those foods such as beans or legumes, soy or soy products such as edamame, tofu, or tempeh, um, nuts and nut butters, seeds, some whole grains, hemp, peas, and then meat and dairy substitutes, for example, like non-dairy yogurts or cheeses, or some of those plant-based meat alternates, like Beyond a Burger is an example of that. Um, so certain plant-based proteins, if we think like grains, or some of these beans or legumes, they also contain a starchy component. So while they are, what we consider a protein source, they do also contain some of those carbohydrates in the form of starch, and those are going to impact our blood sugars. So it's important to keep in mind if you're building, a balanced plate and you're including some of these plant-based proteins. Um, some soy products, meat and dairy substitutes, and nut butters may also have added sources of sugars or added sources of carbohydrates, maybe to help bind them together or to add flavor. And so, if those products have these carbohydrates or these sugars added, that obviously is going to impact our blood sugar a bit as well. So most plant-based proteins are what we consider an incomplete protein. And what that means is proteins, regardless if it's plant or animal based, are made up of amino acids, and those we call the building blocks of protein. I like to think of them as just like a bunch of different Lego pieces that all are put together to build a protein. When we consume any type of protein, whether that's plant or animal based, in that digestion metabolic process, our body breaks all those apart and we metabolize the amino acids individually and then rebuild them back together after digestion for use in our body. Most plant based sources of proteins do not contain all 9 of what we consider the essential amino acids, or those amino acids that we really need to be eating regularly. Um, so if you follow a primarily plant-based diet, if you're vegetarian, if you're vegan, this is just something to pay a bit more attention to. And my advice is just to eat a wide variety of different protein sources to make sure we're getting a wide variety of those different amino acids. And then certain other foods are complementary. For example, beans are not a complete protein, but the amino acid that they're low in, rice provides or is a good source of that. So eating rice and beans in the same day complement each other and create a complete protein. So animal-based proteins, kind of on that same note, they're always going to be a complete protein, meaning they contain all of those essential amino acids. Um, Pretty obvious, I feel, on this one, but examples of animal-based proteins are meat, poultry, fish and shellfish, eggs, and dairy. Um, Most animal-based proteins on their own are not going to necessarily impact our blood sugars, but when we add maybe a sauce to them, maybe if we add some breading or seasonings to really flavor meat, those can contain carbohydrates or sugars and impact our blood sugars. So back to tying in proteins with the fats that we talked about earlier. It's also important to be conscientious of the types of fats that certain animal-based protein sources have. Um, those that we touched on briefly that are a really great source of those unsaturated fats, those omega-3s or those heart healthy fats, are going to be those fatty fish. And the American Heart Association recommends to eat fish twice per week for those heart healthy fats. Um, those with high amounts of saturated fats, if we think like sausage, bacon, many really processed food or processed meats, we absolutely can eat those foods, but we want to eat them more on occasion rather than have them be the primary animal based protein source in our diet. All right, last but not least, we're going to dive in to carbohydrates. I know this is the nutrient that most of us are most interested in. So this is the macronutrient that does affect our blood sugars. Um, Most people, when they are given a diabetes or pre-diabetes diagnosis, they have the immediate reaction, oh no, I can never eat carbohydrates again, or I really have to follow like a low or no carb diet, and these nutrients tend to be really demonized. However, we know that carbohydrates do play a lot of really important functions in our body. They're the primary source of fuel both for every cell in our body and our brains. So while all three of these macronutrients that we're talking about today, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, do provide calories, do provide energy, our bodies have to go through a much more difficult process to metabolize the proteins and the fats into that energy for our cells. Whereas carbohydrates, it's a really easy process. That's the point of them in our diet, is providing that energy for all of our cells. Um, so what I recommend to anyone, including those with diabetes, is just to include these consistently throughout the day. If you are including carbohydrates with most meals and snacks, again, we're going to be maintaining a more consistent blood sugar range and preventing large spikes and drops. Um, so they provide energy, balance blood sugars, and then also another important note about carbohydrates is they help us with our maintaining our gastrointestinal health. So they help with bowel movement regularity, as well as they keep our little gut biome very happy. All those good bacteria in our gut that really help us to digest food. They really, really love a wide variety of carbohydrate, plant-based food sources. And so getting a variety of carbohydrate sources can really aid in gastrointestinal health, as well as colon cancer prevention, which specifically we'll talk about that a little bit more when we're talking about fiber. Um, And then lastly, carbohydrates can help with healthy cholesterol levels, which again is kind of relating back to that whole heart health component. Um, so rather than focusing on cutting them out entirely, we want to focus on including a consistent amount and really focus on including whole food forms of carbohydrates in our diet. We're going to dive into all of that a little bit more when we talk about the different categories of carbohydrates. All right, so the first category that we're going to talk about that we briefly mentioned earlier are starches. Examples of starches are grains, starchy vegetables. So starchy vegetables are things like peas, potatoes, sweet potatoes, winter squash, and corn. As well as beans or legumes. So all of these foods contain a specific, a higher amount of carbohydrate in that starch form. Um, these types of carbohydrates, while they do affect our blood sugar, we are going to digest them a bit slower than sugars, which we're going to talk about next. So they will help to maintain more consistent blood sugar levels. Um, so sometimes these are referred to as complex carbohydrates, if you've heard those terms, complex versus simple carbohydrates. So complex carbohydrates are carbohydrates that include a fiber source as well as some vitamins and minerals. Um, for example, and this is kind of my last note on this page, to include more whole grains versus refined grains. So if we're thinking of a wheat, um, grain, right? They naturally come with an outer fibrous layer on it. And then there's some other components, some vitamins and minerals that are included in that. In processing, if we are making white bread with that, that outer fibrous layer is removed, and we're really just left with like the meat, the inside part of that grain, and that is what is used to create more refined grain products like white bread, basically any products made with white flour. Another example of this is brown rice versus white rice. White rice and brown rice are, the same grain, but also that outer fibrous layer is removed. Um, that fiber, just like we talked about the proteins earlier and including those with our meals and snacks to help maintain consistent blood sugars, that fiber can do the same thing. So, for example, well, I'm going to use that example in a few slides. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I think it'll make sense on the next slide. Um, so when we are thinking of including these starchy vegetables, for example, a potato on our plate, it's important just to keep in mind that that is, even though it is a vegetable, it is a carbohydrate source because of the starchy component of it, and therefore it is going to impact our blood sugars more so than spinach or asparagus or some of these other vegetables that don't quite have that same starch component. So we want to make sure that when we are building a balanced plate, and we'll dive into that a little bit more at the end of the presentation, we want to be including those starchy vegetables in addition to non-starchy vegetables on our plates. All right, so the next category of carbohydrates that we're going to talk about today are sugars. So examples of sugars in our diet are going to be fruit and fruit juice. Dairy products have some sugars in them, honey, maple syrup, any added sugar, which we think of as just like, white table sugar, or other types of sweeteners. Which it seems like there's so many more sweeteners lately on our shelves at the grocery stores, but such as agave, date sugar, corn syrup, fructose, lactose, dextrose. Um, and so these types of carbohydrates are going to cause the most rapid increase in our blood sugar levels. Um, so if we are eating these food items on their own and we're not really including anything else with that meal or snack, this is when we tend to see a rapid increase in our blood sugars. Um, if we don't have to cut these foods out entirely. Rather, I suggest to include them in our diets with some other food components. So if you can include a fiber, if you can include a protein, if you can include a fat source, our body is, working to digest those all at the same time, and we're not going to digest the sugar component as rapidly, which prevents that rapid spike. Um, Now I'm going to go back to that example that I almost said on the last slide, but I think it's more relevant to this slide. If we think of an apple, and we take that apple, which is a fruit, which contains a sugar, and we put that apple in our juicer, and we get a cup of apple juice, and we really toss out, all of the pulp, all the flesh, all the skin of that apple, and we just drink that glass of apple juice without anything else at that eating experience. That's going to cause a pretty significant rise in our blood sugars. If we ate that apple, not only generally are we going to eat the whole apple slower than we're going to, drink that juice, but it also has that fibrous component to it, meaning we're just going to digest it a bit slower, and it's going to increase our blood sugars, but not quite as rapidly as the juice. Now, if we took that apple, we put it into slices, and we ate those apple slices with some peanut butter, which contains some fat and some protein, we're going to digest that even slower, and that's going to contribute to the most consistent blood sugar levels. So I like to use that example because I feel like it makes sense a bit how these different components can help with blood sugar management. Um, so oftentimes sugars are what we consider a simple carbohydrate. We talked about complex carbohydrates on the previous slide, but a simple carbohydrate, and that is those sugars that often lack those that fiber and vitamins and minerals. Um, Typically, we're given the recommendation to reduce our added sugars in our diet. And if we think of foods that are high in added sugars, those are going to be more calorically dense, right? And if we have a diabetes diagnosis, if we have a pre-diabetes diagnosis, or simply just really wanting to focus on managing our blood sugars, those are going to contribute to more rises and falls. And so you can certainly include added sugars in your diet, even if you have a diabetes diagnosis, but just being conscious of eating those foods with some other of those factors, like we just talked about, um, and just being mindful that they are going to contribute to our total caloric level more so. All right, the last category of carbohydrates that we're going to talk about today are fibers. So we get fiber from any food, any plant-based food in its whole form. So if we think fruits, vegetables, beans and legumes, nuts, seeds, and whole grains, these are in their whole food form in that they don't go through that processing, such as if you juice the apple or you took that fibrous part off of rice or grain. Um, they contain that fiber in their whole food form. Um, like we touched on previously, this fibrous component is going to help us to manage more consistent blood sugar levels, and that's why it's recommended to eat more whole food forms, especially of like fruits and vegetables and grains. Um, because of that fibrous component. And they also contain some fatty acids and vitamins and minerals and other good stuff as well. Um, it's not that you can never have a grain that isn't a whole grain, right? Because some foods simply we just enjoy better in that more like refined grain form, such as an example that most people enjoy are having like sushi with white rice versus brown rice. And it's not that you can never have that, but if you are really wanting to aim for managing our blood sugars, just think, okay, if I am having a some white bread with a meal or white rice. What ways can I add fiber in other ways to that meal? What ways can I add a protein with that meal to help me enjoy that food while also being, aiming for our goal of managing our blood sugars? Um, so other benefits of including fiber regularly in our diet is that they reduce the risk of and help with management of heart disease. They can actually help us to lower our cholesterol. So if you are somebody who has been told you have high cholesterol, making sure you're adding some fiber to your diet can help us to actually lower our cholesterol, um, and then also help us to maintain our GI health, our gastrointestinal health, like we touched on previously, with regular bowel movements and keeping our gut biome happy. Um, Most adults living in the United States eat less than the recommended amount of fiber, and so it can be a really easy addition to just try and add, another fiber source to a meal or snack during your day to really focus on bumping up that fiber layer level. All right. I also wanted to touch on sugar alcohols and sugar substitutes because oftentimes these are found in a lot of, low sugar or no sugar, like sweets or desserts or things that you may want to include because you have a pre-diabetes or diabetes diagnosis or a goal of managing consistent blood sugars. I wanted to touch on the difference today because sugar alcohols can impact our blood sugars, but they are sweeteners that contain about half the calories of regular sugar. Um, so they do impact our blood sugar levels, but less so than more traditional sweeteners like honey, maple syrup, white sugar. Um, Label, if you have a food item that contains these sugar alcohols in them, they may read as low sugar or no added sugar, or sugar free. Some examples of sugar alcohols are mannitol, sorbitol, or xylitol. Sometimes they are even found in like gum or toothpastes. Um, if you are really aiming to reduce your total sugars that you're consuming during the day and really keep consistent blood sugars, they can aid in that, but I recommend avoiding eating these in excess, just like with regular sugars. And the same goes for sugar substitutes, which we consider as non nutritive sweeteners, meaning that they do not provide any calories and they will not impact our blood sugars. We actually do not break these down during digestion, but they do make foods taste sweeter to us. um, they again can help with a goal of managing blood sugars. For example, if you're a soda drinker, if you opt for a diet soda versus a regular soda, that isn't going to impact your blood sugars the same as the regular soda. So, some examples of sugar substitutes are aspartame, sucralose, saccharin, stevia is another common example. So, I just wanted to touch on those briefly. So, this whole presentation, I've been kind of diving into all these different macronutrients and how we should be aiming to include them with our meals and our snacks. When we really are focusing on building healthy meals and snacks, it's most important to focus on that nutrient balance. A variety of foods and food groups contributes to all the different nutrients that our bodies need. I've said many times throughout the presentation to aim for a variety of proteins, carbohydrates, um, and also if we do have a balance or including, that carbohydrate, that protein, that fat with a meal, it makes us feel more satisfied and more full from that meal, so that we can digest it and kind of feel satisfied until our next eating experience, 3, 4 hours later. um, so how do we create nutrient balance? I always recommend aiming to include protein for satisfaction, a carbohydrate or fiber for energy and gastrointestinal health, produce that also provides fiber, vitamins, and minerals, and then nourishing fats for flavor and fullness. So if we think of like a plate model, like the My Plate model, typically we want to aim most often for our meals containing about a quarter of our plate proteins, about a quarter of our plate carbohydrates, and then about half of our plate to be produce. And then obviously those fats don't take up necessarily a portion of our plate, but they can be used in those other food amounts. Like I said, salad dressing to cook a food. Maybe you're having fish for your protein or eggs, and it already contains some of those nourishing fats. Or having avocado on things. There's lots of examples of that. All right, I think we are ready. I don't think I saw any questions. I feel like I flew through that presentation for the last time. Hopefully, I wasn't talking too fast, but please let me know if anyone has any questions after all that information. I knew I threw a lot at you, and hopefully, I can clear up any confusion. If you want any more information on any of this that we talked about today, you can visit diabetiesatlanta.org or diabetes.org. And then they have a whole section on nutrition that talks about the different components, kind of like we did today. And then eatright.org, that is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics website. And they also have some great articles on nutrition for managing blood sugars and diabetes. Yes, can I talk about diet sodas? So I'm going to go back to this slide. So back in the day, there used to just be, you know, diet soda that contained these sugar substitutes, and then regular soda that contained regular sugar. And we know that the regular sodas can really impact our blood sugars, whereas the diet sodas do not impact our blood sugars. Now they have really come out with a lot of different varieties of sodas, ones that maybe do contain more of these sugar alcohols or a lower amount of sugar, or there's just kind of more of a spectrum rather than the no sugar or full sugar. Um, and they do, use different types of sugar substitutes or sugar alcohols in them. But generally, if you are somebody who does enjoy drinking soda and you're really wanting to manage your blood sugars, if you have a regular soda and you're not eating anything else with that soda, that's going to cause a pretty significant increase in your blood sugars. If you have a diet soda, it's really not going to impact your blood sugars if that diet soda just contains those sugar substitutes. Um, Again, we don't want to be having these things in excess. Um, if you really have a goal to kind of reduce overall soda consumption, trying to replace at least one soda a day with some water. You could even replace it with sparkling water, or adding some flavor to your water, like squeezing in some lemon juice or some different flavoring. If drinking plain water really isn't as desirable to you. Um, how so I also got a question about family genetics and a history of high cholesterol. Yeah, so I will say, a lot of this when we are talking about cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes, we know that there is a genetic component to those, right? And so if you have a strong family history of high cholesterol, if you have a strong family history of diabetes, you are at greater risk to also have those chronic disease diagnoses. A really good kind of analogy that I like to use is your genetics are, if we're talking about like a card game, like a game of poker, your genetics are the hand that you're dealt, right? You really don't have control over that hand that you're dealt. How you play your cards, that can really impact the outcome of the game. And so just because you have a strong family history of high cholesterol or diabetes, that doesn't mean that you're just doomed and you might as well not follow any of these nutrition related recommendations to help manage this diagnosis. When we do follow lifestyle and nutrition recommendations for these really can help us to either prevent or manage that diagnosis when we have it. Um, all right. Is there a difference in diet soda and zero sugar soda? Um, I don't know for certain because there are, so many different kinds. Generally, diet soda is going to contain those sugar substitutes. Um, Zero sugar soda may contain more of these sugar alcohols, but I don't know for certain on that one. But that would be my educated guess. So using stevia or monk fruit as a sweetener for diabetes, yeah, these are going to be, at least that stevia is going to be the sugar substitute. And so, and the monk fruit is also a sweetener that doesn't impact our blood sugars as much. So if you're using these as a replacement for sugar or sweetener in, for example, your coffee or your baked goods, they aren't going to increase your blood sugars as much as regular sweetener. So you certainly can use them. Um, Sometimes if we have a lot of these sugar substitutes, they can cause some GI discomfort for people. Um, but if you are really wanting to manage your blood sugars, you can certainly add those. Again, you don't have to completely cut out regular sugars either, but just making sure you're including those other food components. Is it true sherbet is worse than regular ice cream? Um, I wouldn't necessarily say worse, I would just say different. So they both regular ice cream and sherbet both contain amounts of sugar in them, right? They are a dessert item. However, regular ice cream is going to have a higher fat component, specifically a higher saturated fat component than sherbet. So that's just the primary difference in those. So what about simple and complex carbohydrates? Yeah, if we go back, so starches or really fiber containing sources of carbohydrates, those are going to be what we consider complex carbohydrates. And those again are going to help with more consistent blood sugar management than simple carbohydrates, which are going to be like white bread, white flour, juice, soda, things like that. All right. I love this question. You are a cheese lover, and you mentioned saturated fat. What is a good replacement? Um, I don't think you need to replace cheese in your diet. If you are consuming a lot of cheese, and you generally aim for full fat dairy, maybe you would want to shift to maybe including some low fat sources of cheese as well, or lower fat. Um, but I love cheese too. I very much believe in the all foods fit, and that you don't have to um, cut out any food that you love, but just kind of being conscientious of how it can potentially impact, our health goals or I guess the basics of the nutrition of that food. So there's definitely nothing wrong with cheese, and you can include cheese regularly in your diet. Again, if you're having a significant amount of cheese daily, maybe aiming for lower fat versions, but you don't have to cut it out altogether. This is a really good question. What artificial sweeteners cause less GI issues? I don't know if there are specific ones that really cause less for everybody. I think it really depends person to person. Some people don't have any issues with, GI issues from having a lot of these artificial sweeteners. But some people tend to be a bit more sensitive to one versus the other. And so I would say that's really individualistic. And I don't think there's a general like rule for everyone. But again, just with all of these, we don't want to eat in too great of excess. Um, Are there ice creams that have less, um, impact on our blood sugar levels? That's a really good question. There are some ice creams that do that are made with some of these like sugar alcohols or sugar substitutes, or there are a lot of dairy products just in general that they might have like half the sugar. I've seen that more in like yogurts. They might have um, like half the sugar than regular yogurt. So I would say, there probably are some ice cream brands that really do reduce the amount of sugar in them or use sugar alcohols or sugar substitutes to help with that sweetness. Do you recommend vegan products such as vegan cheese, etc.? If you are vegan and you enjoy those things, you enjoy cheese or cheese-like products, then certainly that's a great way to eat them. Um, I don't know if I would necessarily highly recommend them over dairy products. If you do eat dairy, dairy contains a lot of really great nutrients, lots of really great vitamins and minerals. It's also a great protein source. It does also provide us with some carbohydrates as well as fats. So dairy in itself contains all three of these macronutrients. So if you consume dairy, I wouldn't necessarily recommend replacing it. Um, Dairy, again, because it has that carbohydrate component, it is going to impact our blood sugars a bit. The same can be said for vegan products because they generally have a carbohydrate source in them. Any overall recommendations? Oh, this is a good question for a type 1 diabetic versus a type 2 diabetic. Um, I would say in general, the recommendations as far as diet are going to be very, very similar in that we want to really make sure that our intake of carbohydrates is consistent and and making sure that we're including a variety of foods and these other nutritional components. If somebody is taking insulin, we really want to make sure that we are paying attention and not letting our blood sugar levels get too low because that can be dangerous and concerning. And so it's just working with a diabetes educator, either a nurse diabetes educator, a dietitian, or like the Diabetes Association of Atlanta to get resources to help, figure out what's best for you. Everybody's body's a little bit individualized, um, even if we are just talking about a general diabetes diagnosis. Are melons, or especially watermelons, a good fruit for a diabetic? Yeah, that's a great question. Melons, especially watermelon, have a really high water component. And so while they do, of course, contain that sugar in the form of fruit juice, they are going to impact our blood sugars. They're also really hydrating. They also contain that fiber. So they are going to um, digest a bit, slower and not cause that rapid spike. So any fresh fruits are, even though they do contain that sugar, they will affect our blood sugars. You certainly can eat them, and it's maybe important, if you do enjoy watermelon, maybe having that with an additional protein source. And then additionally, I will say dried fruits, which I think there is like a watermelon jerky. I have never tried that, but I have seen that. But if we're thinking like raisins, cranberries, dried apricots, prunes, dried fruits, they really have that water removed and they can impact our sugars a bit more, causing that more rapid increase than those fresh fruits with that water component. Oh, this is a great question. Give an example of a good balanced diet with plant-based foods. Yes. So if we are going back to this like plate model that we thought of, right? It is fairly easy to think about this when we're talking about animal-based proteins. So a piece of salmon or a piece of chicken, and then maybe some rice, or bread, and then maybe a salad and some carrots. That's a super basic example that I just came up with. And then maybe it has some nourishing fats, maybe as a salad dressing, maybe to cook the asparagus in, maybe in some marinade or flavoring on whatever fish or chicken or animal-based protein. So that's a really easy way to think of a balanced plate when we're consuming animal-based proteins. When we are consuming plant-based diet, if we're vegetarian or vegan, we're going to be having more of these plant-based sources of proteins that do contain that starchy component. So for example, if you do have tofu, for example, it is a plant-based protein. It does contain some carbohydrates in it, but you could have like that tofu, rice, kind of that same example. Or if you have beans, just knowing that those beans can kind of overlap the carbohydrate and the protein sections of your plates. What are your thoughts? Okay, I'm gonna answer these together. The keto diet, generally, that's not something that I recommend, just because we know that there are benefits to maintaining consistent carbohydrate levels. And then there's also these other benefits to including carbohydrates with all the fibers, for gastrointestinal health. And you're really cutting vitamins and minerals, all that. You're really cutting a lot of that out on the keto diet. So I think that the benefits of just including balance and consistency are what I recommend more so than keto. The same with intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting I recommend consistency, I guess, more than going long periods of time without eating, because that really doesn't help us to maintain those consistent blood sugars. If we're eating consistently about every 3-ish hours, our blood sugars are going to maintain in a pretty consistent, flux. If we are really going long periods of time with fasting and then eating a large meal, that's really going to contribute to really inconsistent blood sugars. And then if you are somebody who takes insulin or uses insulin to help manage, for example, we really wouldn't want to follow either of these, because we need that carbohydrate intake. Whereas it can be, it can let our blood sugars get a bit too low. Great questions, everyone.
Yes, this was wonderful. Paige, we applaud you for an excellent presentation as always. I can tell that everyone was glued to the screen and trying to rapidly take notes. So you guys, I want you to know that we make these webinars for you. So for the next 2 Wow Wednesdays, we are focused on nutritional health meal planning for persons with diabetes or pre-diabetes, gestational, all the types of diabetes. So this is what I want you to do. You can email us some questions in advance to our diabetisatlanta.org email address. That will give Paige and our teams an idea of some of the specific questions and issues that you are facing. Okay. And then, of course, come prepared for with those questions the next 2 sessions. So again, if you already have some questions about managing your diabetes and meal planning, go ahead and send us some of those questions in advance. We would try to answer all of them, and maybe Paige can also do some research beforehand to address some of the common questions that we are getting. So that is what the Diabetes Association is about. We make sure that we meet people where they are. So thank you for your questions on today. Please share our Wow Wednesday information with your friends and family and colleagues, because again, we do this every 4th Wednesday at noon, and we will have Paige with us the next 2 months. So we are so excited. And after that, we're going to have Chef Reggie with the live cooking demonstration. We're going to have a pharmacist that's going to talk about diabetes and medication. We just have great stuff for you guys. So thank you. Thank you again, Paige. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's great to see all of you, especially our class participants from our diabetes self-management education support classes. I saw Pamela, I saw Danny, I saw so many of you who have just finished that 5-week session of classes. So stay tuned for those who want to participate in our next round of classes. Those will take place in May. So check your emails, okay? Hey, Pamela. All right. Okay, you guys have a
All
great rest
right.
of your day. All right, Paige, we'll talk to you later.
Thank you guys. Thanks everyone.
The video will be on YouTube and we'll try to get it on our website, but definitely our YouTube page. And I'll probably try to get an email out to all of you guys to click the link for this recording. All right. Hey, Mickey, good to see you as well. All right. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.